to really inspire imagination and spark a sense of wonder, to reconnect with nature. We have a beautiful place to do that, to build community and really cultivate what I like to refer to as philosophical sensitivity.
On a Sunday morning in early September, a group of 20 thoughtful walkers gathered at the Silver City Saloon parking lot west of Helena to get started on a 3.5-hour jaunt through the Merlin Nature Preserve, a cohesive collage of private landholdings near Marysville and the Great Divide ski area. Guided by Marisa Diaz-Wen, Executive Director of the Merlin Nonprofit Community Consultancy, the Assembly was joined by 2 special guest speakers tasked with precipitating discussion about issues concerning public and private lands, individual and collective rights, and the importance of considering Indigenous peoples' perspectives on the ownership and/or occupation of property in the context of complex ecological and historical relationships. Edward Glowinka teaches philosophy at Carroll College. Shane Doyle is also an educator and a cultural consultant in Bozeman. Both have extensive resumes. Taking a modern hayride uphill to our launch point was a smart way to conserve everyone's energy. Most of the walking soon to come was downhill and fairly easy, which is a good thing because most of the talking at prearranged stops along the way required the participants to climb some tall verbal trellises.
This is going to be our first spot where we'll discuss land as property and a variety of other things. Ed is going to be talking about that.
At the first pause point, called Red Rock View, Dr. Glowinka got the group oriented to lands questions by invoking the influence of John Locke, a 17th century Enlightenment thinker from England whose views informed Thomas Jefferson and other members of the United States founding generation.
So he writes in the 2 Treatises of Government, in one of the first chapters, that 2 things are required in order to sort of appropriate land as your own and to claim it as property. And they're both problematic, and they have problematic histories, which is why I kind of want to bring them out as questions today. The first thing he says you have to do is you have to mix your labor with the land. Right, so one thing you have to do is you have to mix your labor with it. And this is justified for him on the basis of the idea that the first thing we actually have property over is our own bodies. So our first piece of property is our body, which is something I've honestly struggled with for a long time, a little bit, because I don't know that my primary understanding of my embodiment is as property. I don't know that that would be kind of a pro-understanding. I don't know if it's the only way to look at how our relation to our bodies. I also find it hard to argue against, because at the very least, our body seems to be something that we can defend against the claims of others, right? If somebody tries to claim a right to my body, I have the right to defend that. And so Locke says, it's my property in that regard. And so if we mix our property through our labor with land, that's the first step of sort of claiming it as our own. And the second thing that's needed, and this is quite vague, but I think quite interesting, is it just says you have to leave as much and as good for others. So you have to be able, you mix your labor with land, and you leave as much and as good for others, then you can claim it as your own. So there is a kind of presumption in his work, I would say, of the idea that there will be common land, right? That if you take land, you must leave some common for others. A couple things maybe to say about that. One is that it's while I think interesting that it presumes a common, it's historically been used for all kinds of colonial justifications. Namely that we will work this land better and we can push you off this land and we'll leave that stuff over there for you and that's as much and as good for you, but we can work this better and mix our labor with it more. So Locke was very friendly to private property and very unfriendly to indigenous land rights, with the presumption that indigenous peoples weren't working the land as well as they could. They weren't engaged in agriculture. They weren't engaged in sort of mining and industry. And so we're going to mix our labor with it. You're not mixing enough of your labor with it, and we're leaving as much and it's good for you over there, and we can kind of push you off your land. So I think that has a kind of really complicated history, and I always like to be honest about that. There's a lot in Locke, in his understanding of property, that's been used for pretty nefarious ends.
At our second stop, called Homestead Junction in reference to local habitations stretching back 100 years, it was Shane's turn to explicate Northern Plains Indian tribes' usage of natural resources in an ecological context and mindset.
I think that the tribes of Montana have quite a unique perspective and relationship with the landscape compared to a lot of the other tribes in America. And then there's the broader worldwide understanding of indigenous philosophy, indigenous perspectives towards the land. But I want to start with Montana tribes because I think that they are in many ways unique compared to all the other regions. And so, by 2,000 years ago, agriculture was pretty widespread in what we know of as United States, continental America. Predominantly on the East Coast, of the Iroquois Confederacy, but going down all throughout the Mississippi region. And in fact, one of the largest cities in the world, actually oftentimes called the largest city in the world during its heyday, was Cahokia, in and around present-day St. Louis. That was a society that was built entirely on agriculture, without any domesticated animals at all, really, playing into it. And so these people became quite wealthy, growing corn, beans, and squash along the Mississippi River and the Mississippi River Valley, and established huge structural monuments as a manifestation of the power that they were able to create with all the surplus foods that they grew. And so we're talking about some of the greatest agriculturalists in the world. They did all this without plow horses, without any oxen. They did all this without insurance or sprinklers. They brought up the seeds, the agriculture from South and Mesoamerica, and had just a tremendous amount of success with it. And you could think of the mounds that were established there and the pyramids that were devised. And I guess one of the things I think about when I think of pyramids, and of course we see pyramids throughout the ancient world, is that the pyramids in the physical form also correlate to pyramids in the economic sense of the word. And so you have great wealth, you're able to create great structures. And within those structures, the society also reflects that top-down way of thinking and looking at things. And so the idea that Locke said, that he propagated as much and as good, with the idea that it was a sin not to work the land, and that Native Americans weren't working the land. That's something that we've kind of misunderstood for a long time from a lot of different perspectives. In fact, these Native peoples worked the land quite significantly and to tremendous success in areas where it was possible and viable and made the most sense. Into a greater understanding of how you fit into all this, the birds, the animals, the trees, because you don't own them. They all take care of themselves. They are all their own property as well. And that respect for that is kind of phenomenological understanding of going about our day. I am me, you are you. We all share things, but at the same time, we have some amount of responsibility and cognizant understanding of what we have to do to make ourselves who we are, I guess.
Stop number 3 was situated next to Walkin' Jim Stoltz Pond and just downhill from a cluster of buildings from the Homestead era. Stoltz, now deceased, was a well-known folk singer in the Helena area. At this juncture, Ed and Shane tag-teamed the topic of individual and collective rights. Sorting out how rights can coalesce and contradict at the same time led to an extended conversation. Philosophical pathways are prone to detours and asides, all in good faith and good fun.
It brings up the whole question of how we use the word right, because at least how it's ingrained in our culture, it's like, inherent or given by a creator or something like that, and that those exist. And maybe we should stop using the word right in that sense and realize that it's really based on values. And those values, as you were just saying, change. It's like, I don't want to, allow women in my college or whatever. And we've said, no, you can't do that. And so this idea of rights as something in essence seems like a bad thing. It's like an in perpetuity thing. It's like, wait a minute, things change. We have to acknowledge that. We have to say, okay, these are based on what our society values. And I think that's hard to do because people want them to be transcendent. They want to say, oh, it's always been this way, or our way is the best way, or whatever. But yeah, the whole question of the word right comes up. Is like, really, are those things inherent? Really just a reflection of it.
And Amartya Sen, the Nobel-winning economist, he talks about them in this way a lot, right? That if collective rights are going to start to have a use, let's say to protect indigenous rights to self-determination, these rights come about because we decide they're valuable.
Right.
Not
yeah.
because there's inherently always been collective rights or individual rights, but this is an expression of kind of what we value. And right now, looking at, colonial past, genocide, etc., we decide we have to value this in this way. So I do think there's something to that line of thinking in terms of what we mean by right.
After the unavoidable joy of a group photo, Marisa jumped in the driver's seat for the return trip to home base. Along the way, while Ed and Shane dutifully spoke a bit about environmental ethics and stewardship, most of what was said amounted to informed small talk and amusing anecdotes, the best sort of exchange while sitting on hay bales and scouting the hillsides for elk. Doctors Glowinka and Doyle added a lot of intellectual value to this walk in the woods. Happily, their different origins, background, and outlook were complementary, and they shared their knowledge in an informal way that elicited lots of comments and questions. Walking, talking, and thinking go well together. That's the practical magic of Merlin's down-to-earth approach to philosophy, strolling together under the big sky and conversing about ideas that are as current as today's media headlines and as venerable as earthly civilization itself.